reports that Cleopatra's DNA has been matched to a black family in Detroit are taking the internet by storm. If true, it could answer a question that historians have argued about for generations. But there's one part of the story that has everyone completely baffled. The idea as it circulates online is this: scientists have extracted and analyzed DNA from Cleopatra, the most famous queen in the ancient world, and that genetic material has been matched to the lineage of a black family living in Detroit, Michigan. The implication is obvious, that Cleopatra was black, that her ancestry has been hidden or suppressed by mainstream historians, and that a modern family in the American Midwest is carrying her royal blood. The videos pushing this story lean heavily into the framing. Urgent voiceovers, stock footage of Egyptian ruins dissolving into American city streets, dramatic pauses before the shocking reveal, titles like DNA of Cleopatra has finally been analyzed. The result is worse than we thought, and Cleopatra's DNA tells a terrifying story. The comment sections are flooded with people writing things like, "They've been hiding this for years," and "Africa built the world and they erased it." For millions of viewers, this feels like vindication, like long suppressed history finally being reclaimed. And here's why the story lands the way it does. Cleopatra is not just a historical figure, she is a symbol. She sits at the intersection of Africa, the ancient world, and power. For the African American community in particular, a community whose ancestral roots were systematically erased by the transatlantic slave trade, the idea of a direct genetic link to one of history's most powerful rulers carries enormous emotional weight. The ancestry testing boom has made these kinds of stories feel plausible. People take 23andMe tests and discover connections they never knew existed. So when a video tells you that a black family in Detroit shares DNA with Cleopatra, the emotional framework for believing it is already in place. But let's go straight to the foundational problem with this story. No confirmed tomb of any Ptolemaic ruler has ever been found, which means genetic testing on Ptolemaic remains is simply impossible. There is no sample, there is no lab, there is no Detroit family, there is no peer-reviewed study. Not one named historian or geneticist has gone on record to express shock over a Cleopatra DNA match to anyone. The claim exists entirely in the content economy of YouTube and TikTok, where the algorithm rewards outrage and wonder in equal measure, and where the gap between what feels true and what is documented can be as wide as 2,000 years of history. Now, the reason this specific story is gaining traction right now is not random. It is directly connected to a sequence of real, documented scientific events that are genuinely fascinating, that have been stripped of their actual meaning and reassembled into something they never were. And to understand how that happened, you have to understand the actual story of Cleopatra's ancestry, which is itself one of the most contested questions in all of ancient history. The race and skin color of Cleopatra III-7, the last active Hellenistic ruler of the Macedonian Greek Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt, has caused some debate, though generally not in scholarly sources. That distinction between popular debate and scholarly consensus is everything, because what the scholars say and what the internet says are two entirely different conversations, and they have been running in parallel for decades. Cleopatra was of Macedonian Greek descent, a fact well documented by historical sources. She was a descendant of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Greek ruling family established by Ptolemy I Soter, one of Alexander the Great's generals, who took control of Egypt after Alexander's death in 323 BCE. His descendants ruled that kingdom for nearly 300 years. The Ptolemies were of Macedonian Greek origin and followed a strict tradition of marrying within their own family to maintain their lineage. In fact, Cleopatra's ancestors engaged in sibling marriages, a common practice among the Ptolemies to preserve their Greek heritage. While her mother remains uncertain, possibly Cleopatra vi Tryphena, who may have had partial Egyptian descent, historical evidence indicates Cleopatra was at minimum 3/4 Macedonian Greek, with no substantiated non-Mediterranean elements in her forebears. Coin portraits and a few authenticated portrait busts of Cleopatra do not indicate anything other than a European Macedonian heritage. So on the surface, the scholarly record is relatively clear, but that is not where the story ends. Because the reason videos like this can exist at all, the reason there is any gap for them to exploit, is rooted in a real archaeological discovery, a genuine academic debate, a BBC documentary, and ultimately a bombshell scientific paper published in 2025 that turned the entire conversation on its head. And the way that paper got distorted into a story about a family in Detroit, to understand how a claim this specific gets built, you have to go back to a single archaeological find: a skull discovered in a water-filled sarcophagus in the ancient city of Ephesus, Turkey. The year was 1929. An Austrian archaeologist named Josef Kahl and his team were excavating a grand structure on the main street of ancient Ephesus, a structure known as the Octagon. They found a water-filled sarcophagus within the ruins of the Octagon, a grand structure along the main street of ancient Ephesus. Although no significant grave goods were present, the sarcophagus contained a complete skeleton. His initial analysis suggested the skull belonged to a very distinguished person, likely a 20-year-old woman. Without concrete evidence, he transported the skull to Vienna upon joining the University of Vienna. This skull sat in Viennese collections for decades. Then, in 1953, a new analysis reignited the conversation. Josef Wenninger, from the University of Vienna's Institute of Anthropology, published an article with detailed photos and measurements. He concluded that the skull was from a young woman of refined features, possibly indicating aristocratic lineage from antiquity. Then, in 1990, a theory emerged that would change everything. The theory arose that the skull might belong to Arsinoe IV, due to the architectural similarity of the octagon with the Lighthouse of Alexandria, a symbol of Ptolemaic power, and the historical fact that Arsinoe was executed in Ephesus in 41 BC. This narrative gained popularity and became the subject of numerous studies and academic debates, keeping alive the possibility that Cleopatra's sister's remains rested in this lavish tomb. Who was Arsinoe? She was Cleopatra's sister, or half-sister, and one of the most dramatic figures orbiting Cleopatra's story. After losing a power struggle against her sister Cleopatra and Julius Caesar, Arsinoe was exiled to Ephesus. In 41 BCE, she was executed on Mark Antony's orders, cementing her as a key figure in the intertwined histories of ancient Egypt and Rome. Now, here's where the Black Cleopatra mythology gets its first real scientific foothold. In 2009, a BBC documentary titled Cleopatra, a Time Watch special, used forensic reconstruction techniques on this skull. The documentary suggested the skull showed mixed features that, the narrator implied, pointed toward African ancestry in Arsinoe. And since Arsinoe and Cleopatra shared the same father, Ptolemy XII, the logical leap was immediate. If Arsinoe had African blood, then so did Cleopatra. The documentary caused a ripple. It was picked up, amplified, and woven into the broader Afrocentric narrative around Cleopatra. It felt like evidence. It had a BBC logo attached to it. For over a decade, it circulated as the scientific backbone of the Black Cleopatra argument. There was only one problem. The remains were hypothesized to be those of Arsinoe IV, sister or half-sister to Cleopatra, and conjecture based on discredited processes suggested that the remains belonged to a girl whose race may have been North African. This claim is rejected by scholars, based on the remains being impossible to identify as Arsinoe. The race of the remains being impossible to identify at all, the fact that the remains belonged to a child much younger than Arsinoe when she died, and the fact that Arsinoe and Cleopatra shared the same father but may have had different mothers. Scholars had been saying this for years, but in 2025, the definitive answer arrived, and it did not come from opinion or historical argument. It came from a laboratory using some of the most advanced forensic techniques ever applied to an ancient skull. A skull long thought to belong to Arsinoe IV, sister of Cleopatra, has been confirmed to be the remains of a boy with developmental disorders, according to a new study published in the journal Scientific Reports. The research was led by Gerhard Weber, an anthropologist at the University of Vienna, who applied state-of-the-art methods to examine the skull. The research employed cutting-edge methods, including microcomputed tomography, micro-CT scans, radiocarbon dating, and DNA analysis to uncover the truth about the skull. A recent study by a team of scientists led by anthropologist Gerhard Weber from the University of Vienna confirmed the skull belonged to a boy aged 11 to 14. High-resolution imaging and detailed morphological analysis revealed that the boy was in puberty. Researchers determined his age by examining the development of his dental roots and the base of his skull. The analysis also uncovered severe growth abnormalities. His skull was asymmetrical and unusually shaped, partly due to the premature fusion of a cranial suture that typically closes around the age of 65. And the gender question was settled beyond any doubt. The big surprise came when repeated tests showed the presence of a Y chromosome, Weber said. That put the conclusion beyond any doubt that the remains belong to a male, not Arsinoe IV. The remains are those of a boy between the ages of 11 and 14 who suffered from pathological developmental disorders. His genes point to an origin in Italy or Sardinia. This study refutes the claim that Arsinoe IV was buried in the octagon. The findings indicate the individual was a Roman boy of high social status, although the Egyptian-inspired architectural elements of the tomb remain unexplained. So the one piece of physical evidence that had anchored the African ancestry theory of Cleopatra for over 15 years. The 2009 BBC documentary's forensic reconstruction was built on a skull that belonged to a young Roman boy from Sardinia who had a malformed jaw and never set foot in Egypt. The entire edifice collapsed. It fed it. Within weeks of the University of Vienna study's publication in January 2025, content creators on TikTok and YouTube began packaging the debunking itself as new evidence, twisting the news that the Arsinoe skull was wrong into claims that new DNA analysis on Cleopatra had proven something shocking. The story of a lie being corrected became the raw material for a new lie. Before we get into how these videos build their narratives, it's worth pausing on the actual history, because the real Cleopatra is, by any measure, more fascinating than anything a clickbait video has ever claimed about her. Cleopatra VII was the last pharaoh of the Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt, a Hellenistic state founded by Macedonian Greeks, and her ethnicity reflected the dynasty's origins in predominantly Macedonian Greek ancestry. The Ptolemaic rulers, descending from Ptolemy I Soter, a Macedonian general under Alexander the Great, maintained a lineage that emphasized Greek heritage through repeated sibling and cousin marriages. To preserve dynastic purity, with Cleopatra's paternal genealogy tracing unbroken to these Hellenistic roots. What makes Cleopatra extraordinary is not her bloodline. It is what she did with a bloodline that was almost entirely foreign to the country she ruled. Many people believe Cleopatra was Egyptian by blood, but she was actually Macedonian Greek. No clear evidence exists that she had Egyptian ancestry. However, she fully embraced Egyptian culture, dressed as the goddess Isis, and ruled like a native pharaoh. Unlike many of her predecessors, Cleopatra was unique in that she embraced Egyptian culture, including religious traditions and language. According to the Cambridge Ancient History, she was the first Ptolemaic ruler to actually learn the Egyptian language, a decision that helped her solidify her position with the native population. Think about that for a second. Her dynasty had been ruling Egypt for over 200 years by the time Cleopatra came to the throne, and not one of her predecessors had bothered to learn the language of the people they governed. She was the first. She also reportedly spoke 9 languages total. She didn't need to claim African blood to be remarkable. She ruled one of the most powerful kingdoms in the world, with 9 languages in her head and a political mind sharp enough to align herself with both Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, the 2 most powerful Roman men of her era. Debates around Cleopatra's racial identity are ahistorical, because they reflect contemporary views about race, rather than how people were understood in ancient times. This is a critical point. The question of whether Cleopatra was black or white is a modern American question. It is built on modern American racial categories. Ancient Mediterranean society did not operate on those categories. Under Ptolemaic and Roman rule, ethnic descent was crucial to belonging to an elite group and afforded a privileged position in society. Identity in Cleopatra's Egypt was about cultural performance, political allegiance, and class, not the binary racial taxonomy that emerged from the Atlantic slave trade 2,000 years later. And what does actual ancient Egyptian DNA look like? A landmark peer-reviewed study published in Nature Communications extracted and analyzed DNA from ancient Egyptian mummies, the largest such study of its kind. The samples recovered from Middle Egypt span around 1,300 years of ancient Egyptian history, from the New Kingdom to the Roman period. The analyses reveal that ancient Egyptians shared more ancestry with Near Easterners than present-day Egyptians who received additional sub-Saharan admixture in more recent times. Read that carefully. Ancient Egyptians, the people who built the pyramids, who created the Book of the Dead, who ruled the Nile Valley for 3 millennia, carried ancestry more closely related to people in the Near East than to sub-Saharan Africans, and the sub-Saharan ancestry that does appear in the modern Egyptian population came after the ancient period, not before it. The only rulers of Egypt known to have been black were the Kushite kings of the 25th dynasty, who ruled from 747 to 656 BC, over 600 years before Cleopatra was born, and under a completely different dynasty with completely different origins. So the actual science, the actual archaeology, and the actual ancient DNA all point in the same direction, and not one piece of that evidence contains a Detroit family. That invention did not come from a laboratory. It came from a specific corner of the internet that has built an entire industry around it. Part 4, the content machine, how these videos get made and why they spread. The DNA of Cleopatra matched a black family in Detroit narrative is not an accident. It is a product. It is manufactured inside a well-worn content pipeline that has been running for years, and it is worth understanding exactly how it operates, because this is not the first video of this kind, and it will not be the last. The formula is consistent. Take a real historical figure with a contested identity. Add the word DNA. Attach a specific modern location, Detroit, Atlanta, Chicago, to give the claim geographic specificity that feels documentable. Wrap it in the language of suppressed truth. Historians are shocked. They tried to hide this. The results are terrifying. The TikTok and YouTube channels driving these videos specialize in what might be called ancestral shock content, a genre that blends family history, ancient mysteries, and identity politics into algorithmically optimized packages. Cleopatra's DNA tells a terrifying story, and DNA of Cleopatra has finally been analyzed. The result is worse than we thought. They use urgent voiceovers, dramatic pauses, and cuts between ancient ruins and modern black families to construct a visual argument that feels emotionally complete, even when the factual content is empty. The reason these videos work is not stupidity on the part of the audience. It is something more fundamental. For African Americans specifically, the question of ancestral origin is not academic. The transatlantic slave trade was, among its many horrors, a systematic erasure of genealogical memory. Enslaved people were stripped of their names, their languages, their family structures, and their documented histories. The result is that tens of millions of black Americans today carry ancestry they cannot trace beyond the middle of the 19th century. The explosion of commercial DNA testing, 23andMe, Ancestry DNA, African Ancestry, represents an attempt to close that gap. And it is in that emotional space, the longing for connection, for origin, for a lineage that was stolen, that these videos plant their hooks. The claim is not just Cleopatra was black. The deeper claim is, your connection to greatness was taken from you, and now we are giving it back. That is an extraordinarily powerful message, and it does not require a single verified fact to land. The 2025 University of Vienna study that definitively debunked the Arsinoe skull, a study that should have ended one of the key arguments in this space, was almost immediately repurposed. Content creators presented the news that a DNA study on remains connected to Cleopatra's family had been conducted and produced shocking results. They left out the part where the results were that the skull belonged to a boy from Sardinia. They left out the part where the Y chromosome confirmed no female DNA was present. They took a story about the limits of what we know and repackaged it as a story about the forbidden truth of what was discovered. The Detroit family element of the specific claim we're examining takes this one step further. By localizing the supposed DNA match to a real American city, a city with a large, historically significant black population, the story gains a kind of documentary texture. It implies a named family, a named lab, a named study. None of those things exist, but the specificity makes the claim feel reportable, shareable, real. Experts tell Time that modern racial categories don't apply easily to historical figures like Cleopatra. That complexity, the honest, nuanced truth of ancient identity, cannot compete on social media with the blunt emotional impact of her DNA matched a family in Detroit, and so the videos keep coming and the comment sections keep filling up. And the actual history keeps getting buried under the weight of a story that feels right, even though it isn't. Part 5. The Netflix Firestorm, the Culture Wars, and what the real stakes are. The DNA matched a black family in Detroit claim does not exist in a vacuum. It sits inside one of the most polarizing cultural debates of the last several years, a debate that exploded into global headlines in 2023, when Netflix released a docudrama that put the question of Cleopatra's identity at the center of a full-scale international controversy. In May 2023, Netflix premiered African Queens, Queen Cleopatra, a docudrama series produced by Jada Pinkett Smith. the docudrama, in which Britain's Adele James, who is of mixed heritage, plays the first-century Egyptian ruler as a queen with African roots, sparked an uproar in Egypt. Egyptian academics claimed that Cleopatra, who was born in the Egyptian city of Alexandria in 69 BC and belonged to a Greek-speaking dynasty, was of European descent and not black. The reaction from Egypt was immediate and furious. When the series was announced, a lawyer filed a complaint with Netflix that accused African queens, Queen Cleopatra, of violating media laws and aiming to erase the Egyptian identity. Egyptologist Zahi Hawass told the Al-Masri Al-Yum newspaper, "This is completely fake. Cleopatra was Greek, meaning that she was light-skinned, not black." Lawyer Mahmoud Al-Samari filed the case with the public prosecutor, demanding that the state block access to Netflix. The Supreme Council of Antiquities, which is responsible for Egypt's cultural heritage, and its archaeological sites, published a press release confirming Queen Cleopatra had light skin and Hellenistic features. The ratings told their own story. The film received a shockingly low rating of 1.2 out of 10 on IMDb, and on Rotten Tomatoes it received only 13% on the Tomatometer. Meanwhile, the people behind the production pushed back. Jada Pinkett Smith discussed the decision in an interview, saying it had been important for her to cast a woman of color as Cleopatra. "I really wanted to represent black women," she said. "We don't often get to see or hear stories about black queens, and that was really important for me." James took to Twitter to tell critics, "If you don't like the casting, don't watch the show." The director of the documentary, Tina Garavi, framed it in explicitly political terms, asking what it was exactly that made people so uncomfortable about a black Cleopatra, and arguing that Hollywood had long indoctrinated audiences into a Eurocentric image of ancient power. The controversy split neatly along existing fault lines. On one side, African-American viewers and Afrocentric scholars, who saw the casting as a long overdue corrective to centuries of whitewashing ancient history. On the other, Egyptian scholars, Greek historians, and a significant portion of the global audience who saw it as a factual distortion that erased a specific historical identity in favor of a contemporary American identity politics framework. Both of those responses contain real things. The Eurocentric casting of ancient history is a real phenomenon. Elizabeth Taylor playing Cleopatra, a Macedonian Greek ruler of Egypt, with full Hollywood glamour and no engagement with the historical complexity of her identity, is itself a form of narrative flattening. And the genuine erasure of African civilizations from mainstream historical consciousness is real. The Nubian, 25th dynasty pharaohs, rulers who were unambiguously sub-Saharan African, governed Egypt with sophistication and power that never gets the same Hollywood treatment. That erasure is a legitimate grievance. But the response to that erasure cannot be to invent a different erasure. What is truly shameful is how some have attempted to appropriate ancient Egyptian history, and also to deny modern-day Egyptians their cultural heritage by dismissing them as Arab invaders. Modern Egyptians are not an abstraction. They are the descendants of the people who built this civilization. And when their specific heritage gets overwritten by a different group's need for symbolic ancestry, that is its own form of colonial logic. Now here is where we arrive at the verdict on the original claim. The DNA of Cleopatra has not been matched to a black family in Detroit. It has not been matched to anyone. No confirmed tomb of any Ptolemaic ruler has been found to this day. Consequently, genetic testing on Ptolemaic remains is impossible. There is no sample. There is no study. There is no Detroit family. The claim is fabricated, assembled from the wreckage of a debunked BBC documentary. The emotional resonance of ancestral searching, and the architecture of social media outrage. The real Cleopatra was a Macedonian Greek ruler who spoke Egyptian to her subjects, dressed as Isis to her priests, and negotiated with Rome while seated on a throne. Built by a dynasty of inbreeders who spent 300 years trying not to become Egyptian. She was brilliant, she was ruthless, she was a survivor in one of the most brutal political environments in human history. And she did all of that without being the person the clickbait needs her to be. Ancient Egyptians shared more ancestry with Near Easterners than present-day Egyptians, who received additional sub-Saharan admixture in more recent times. Meaning the genetic story of Egypt is genuinely complex, genuinely fascinating, and genuinely worth understanding. But that complexity requires engagement with actual science, not with a TikTok voiceover telling you that historians are shocked. The real shock is simpler. It is that a civilization this extraordinary? A world of polyglot queens, mummified gods, alien-feeling architecture, and 3,000 years of unbroken culture gets reduced in the attention economy to a proxy battle for 21st century American racial politics. Cleopatra deserves better than to be a thumbnail. So does history.